This week on Chatter, Katie Benner of the New York Times on covering the Justice Department during the crazy.
One of the interesting things about the Trump era is that Trump made it very politically costly to try to hold him to account. Look at what happened to everybody who touched the Mueller investigation. So after January 6th, you had a department that was still pretty shell-shocked. You know, history, when we live it, it changes us. And we're not the same people we were before the thing happened. And departments, institutions are made up of people. You know, the Trump era has forced people to ask questions they didn't have to ask before. So in a post-Trump era, to say we're just going to go back to regular order, I thought that is either extremely naive or just something that's very comforting to say.
So, Katie, I want to start with a time, I think it was right around the beginning of the Trump administration, when you emailed me and we'd never met and told me you were coming to D.C. to cover the Justice Department and asked me to have coffee. And so, and we met at Java House and we had a protracted conversation about covering the Justice Department. It was right when you came to Washington. So let's start there. When was that, and how long have you been covering the Justice Department for the New York Times?
Oh my goodness, yes. So I took the job in December, it might have been November of 2017. Donald Trump had been president not even a year. And I was supposed to start on January, whatever it was, right after New Year's Eve, right after New Year's, so maybe January 3rd, 4th, 5th, around that period. And that's when we would have met. And I remember coming to the Washington bureau from the San Francisco bureau of the New York Times, where
you were kind of like a tech reporter before that.
Yeah,
right?
I'd been a Wall Street reporter and then a tech reporter, always business, which I still miss. It's one of the best things you can cover. And I got to the DC bureau and it was still kind of, it had the vibe of a fairly shell-shocked place, as did kind of the city.
Yeah, sort of like the people in the middle of the Blitz.
Right, exactly. And, you know, people hadn't gotten very much sleep. I think people had been drinking very heavily across the city. And I came from Northern California where I'd been sleeping 7, 8 hours a night and, going on hikes. And so I was not necessarily culturally prepared for what I was about to experience. And I found it very curious because I obviously went to my colleagues and other people who'd covered DOJ and worked at DOJ and said, could you give me a list of everybody you think I should talk to just to give me some working knowledge of the building, the culture of it, and what's going on? And everybody said, yeah, we'll do that, but also know that it's completely different now. So everything you're going to hear is kind of like an ancient lore of a time before. And I was like, how could that be? You know, how could a huge institution with hundreds of thousands of employees change in 9 months? I thought that sounded totally absurd. And then we met and you were basically like, good luck.
Yeah.
You will never find any information. But you know, that it was going to, you did say that it was like probably the most interesting time to cover the building.
Yeah, certainly that, I guess the period between then and now, there has never been a week that it hasn't been super interesting across 10 different axes. So what was the lore of the department that you found most obviously wrong? I mean, not because anybody believed it but like things that people said, well, this is ancient history. And you walked in and you were like, wow, that really must be ancient history because it sure doesn't describe this building now.
Well, there are kind of two pieces of that. So one, I got here and I was really surprised at how there was this, I heard rhetoric all the time about how the men and women of the FBI are unimpeachable and everybody knows that. And I was like, really? Because that's just not true. I mean, they look at everything through Watergate, look at Hoover, look at what happened to the civil rights movement, look at what happened to MLK. And I was like, what has happened in this place where all these Democrats I know who are exactly of the age where they'd be highly suspicious of the FBI are going on cable news and saying and being quoted in major publications saying, like, everybody knows the FBI is completely unimpeachable and trustworthy. And I thought, okay, something's definitely happened there, because that's like being in the upside down. And then the other piece, when I came, is there was a lot about how the Justice Department was a completely apolitical place. And what I found is that it's so much more subtle than that. It is, for the most part, a place where people just don't care about politics, in part because they have a lot of work to do and they just want to clear things off their desk. They're generally overworked, but also that it's in tension with the reality that the top of the department is politically appointed and itself has to do this dance of supporting the administration's political priorities and prosecutions, which are different. And so, but because one of the things that had happened under Trump is that there was no room for, it felt like there was no room for subtlety anymore and no room for nuance. So you had these really broad things that everybody had to believe. And if you didn't outright believe them or question them or try to inject nuance, you failed a purity test of some sort. You failed like a pro-institution purity test, a pro-institution anti-Trump purity test. And I think that was true not just for the way people saw DOJ, but all sorts of places in Washington, State Department, CIA, of course, FBI, etc. So I thought that it reminded me, remember after 9/11 when The Onion had an article that was like, irony is dead, like we'll never have it again? Kind of felt like that, where it was like, nuance, goodbye.
Right. So I'm going to bounce around time-wise a little bit, but I think of you every time some major investigation, starting with the January 6th committee and now the special counsel, um, makes a big deal of the attempted coup at the Justice Department, which is, of course, a story that you broke and nobody, like, people didn't really pay attention to at the time, except Justice Department obsessives like me. But right after January 6th, you guys ran this story about Jeffrey Clark and his superiors, which is now central to the the prosecution of Trump. And I'm curious. Um, I'm curious, first of all, were you surprised to see it as central as it is? And secondly, did you learn anything from the indictment that you didn't already know?
So on the latter question, I think that by the time the indictment came out, there was very little of it that hadn't already been in the public between the reporting I'd done and then the things unearthed by the January 6th committee. That was what actually surprised me about the indictment, is that there wasn't a more smoking gun feel, that it was really all known. I mean, with the exception of like things at the margin, conversations he had with Pence or with maybe one with Meadows that weren't public, but they don't do anything to really add to our knowledge. I was actually quite surprised that there wasn't a, co-conspirator for or, White House aide A said that, Donald Trump told him on December 14th that he knew he'd lost, but he wanted to do this anyway. It was really interesting to me that so much of it was already known. And then in terms of the story itself, it was a funny story because we were all very obsessed with January 6th, of course. And I was doing a lot of reporting then. I was working with Adam Goldman. We were just trying to break as much news as possible about the Justice Department and what it was doing about January 6th. And I think Adam and I did a great job getting a lot out there. And then in one stray conversation I had with somebody, I said, we were talking about this, and he goes, listen, he was like, this is crazy. I really do think that we are responding as well as we can as the department to this horrific attack. And he said, but you would not believe how crazy it got here before January 6th.
Burying the lead there.
And I was like, oh, okay. I was like, well, how? And he goes, I can't even talk about it. He was like, maybe after, Biden's president, maybe like we can get a drink or something. And he was like, I don't know. He's like, it's just so stressful. And I was like, oh, that's weird. So then on Inauguration Day, when Biden had been president for about a minute,
followed up,
gave a ring and was like, hey, remember all about how crazy it was inside? I'm just so curious. I had always assumed he was talking about some anticipation of an attack or something, you know what I mean? That there'd been like a conversation where the Justice Department had tried to have some fight with like Muriel Bowser, the mayor of DC, to do something. I don't know. I was just like, because, you're thinking about the attack. And he was like, ugh. And so as I was learning more about this, I thought, this is literally insane. And even when I wrote the story, I remember even sitting down to write it. I wrote it in one night once I'd finally nailed down all the sourcing. And I really wanted to tell, it was so cinematic. And, but I remember thinking, we'd seen Trump, especially with the call he made to the president of Ukraine, try to use levers of power and use like already well-worn channels of power. It's not like Donald Trump would be the first president to call another world leader and ask them to do something. I mean, like,
or even to lean on him to do, or even to right, like exert pressure. We do that.
LBJ. Hello? I mean, Johnson was known for his ability to exert pressure in ways that were questionable at times. So anyway, but he was willing to co-opt levers of power in ways that broke a norm or in ways that could have broken a law. And so I remember when I was reporting the story thinking he wanted to use the remaining shreds of legitimacy of the Justice Department to basically publicly lie so that he could seize electoral votes in Georgia. Like, I mean, as you know, I'm not a lawyer, but I thought that feels like it's probably going to be something we talk about for years to come, just in discussions and debates about executive power. And certainly even after January 6th, there just on January 7th, the cry over Trump's culpability. I remember thinking, well, he did so much before this attack, and that's going to really play into a state of mind before the attack, his intent. So I'm actually not surprised that it's become as big a part of accusations of criminal activity, but I just didn't know how it would be. I'm not a lawyer, so I just knew at the time that like, a curious investigator would certainly think, okay, he's willing to use all the power he has and then push past the power he may or may not have into totally murky, uncharted legal waters.
So I want to talk to you about one of the meta questions about the Justice Department's handling of the post-election period. And I'm going to sketch this out in two ways and then ask you which aspects of both you think is right. So the first is the common sense that the Justice Department really dragged its feet on Trump. That that Merrick Garland was slow to allow an investigation of Trump, particularly to be predicated, that he insisted on this bottoms-up strategy that focused on large numbers of relatively low-grade defenders, that he really was concerned that the investigation not appear to be political, and that as a result, the Justice Department got caught flat-footed by the January 6th committee and kind of only then snapped into action and ultimately appointed Jack Smith, who has been running full speed ever since. The second theory is one that you and I have talked about before. And, you back when we interviewed you for the Aftermath, and you were really stressing how fast the department was moving with respect to January 6th arrests, prosecutions, and other things, mostly related to low grade or medium grade violent perpetrators. But you were interested in sort of correcting the perception that the investigation was moving slowly and were insistent that it was actually moving very quickly. And so I'm interested how you reconcile these two basic narratives. Is it because one of them is wrong, or is it because they really made a strategic decision to focus on low grade offenders first and turn to Trump later?
If a house burns down, there are a lot of ways to go about figuring out what to do. You can spend all of your time trying to get every salvageable object out of the house and move it really, really fast, or you can say, I need to spend more time figuring out who's ultimately responsible for starting the fire. So I think that the department did move very fast on the salvaging all the objects out of the house piece, right? And I think that but that doesn't mean that they weren't moving fast, but it's sort of like, what's your focus? And so for people who hate Donald Trump, they're like, they moved too slow. But in terms of just pure speed, they were moving quickly, especially given that I would say the police officers on the ground did not hold everybody in the building. They let them all go. So it necessitated this like nationwide manhunt as opposed to sealing everybody in the building, arresting them, and putting them in jail, which would have been a different way to go, which would mean the department would have had to do less of the manhunt. But that's not what happened. So they moved really fast to try to get those people. It's so funny, though, the idea of Merrick Garland himself. So, I think it's a question of focus. And so if what you believe is that Donald Trump is responsible, the focus was in the wrong place. There was lots of energy in being expended every day, but you would say it was just being expended on the wrong thing. Now, also, I think that might be called into question, too, because notice every time Donald Trump wants to get people out into the streets to protest and support him in an egregious way, they haven't done it. And I think that having 1,000 people arrested and many of them convicted has helped deter that kind of violent action. He's been indicted now 3 times.
And Joe Biden was inaugurated. I mean,
Joe Biden was
they pulled a lot of people off the streets in an effort to prevent things from interfering with the inauguration.
I think Mar-a-Lago being raided, 3 indictments. Every time Trump has made very provocative statements about how people should be out on the street supporting him, and they're not. And I do think that the idea of doing time in prison is it's not worth it. So, but I think the question of why the focus was where it is, I think that I'll tell you one thing that's just a hunch. I could be totally wrong. And then some stuff based on reporting. I hate the hunch stuff, so I'll do it first. But my if I had to guess, one of the interesting things about the Trump era is that Trump made it very politically costly to try to hold him to account. Other presidents could have done this. They just didn't, right? Bill Clinton could have attacked Janet Reno. George W. Bush could have attacked the Justice Department for daring to investigate the torture stuff and said that they were un-American, grotesque deep staters who didn't care about American security and wanted Americans to die and loved terrorists. He didn't say that. It's just, but Trump, for all sorts of reasons, including that it would undermine democracy, Trump made it so politically costly to try to hold him to account or even raise questions about his behavior that after January 6th, you had a department that was still pretty shell-shocked. I mean, they were just, look at what happened to everybody who touched the Mueller investigation. Look to anybody who worked in the DC U.S. Attorney's Office when they were trying to figure out jail time for Roger Stone. Look at what happened to Jesse Liu in the U.S. Attorney who did not successfully prosecute Andrew McCabe. She paid for that. So he made, she was essentially pushed out of the department. And so he made that cost so high. it might be subconscious, but when you are thinking to yourself, how do I deal with this man? A legitimate but extremely safe and slow way is to say we're going to go from the bottom up, and if it leads to him, it leads to him, and without fear or favor, we're going to go after him. But, we can't get there until the evidence takes us there. So I do wonder about that.
Yeah, so I'm curious, when I kind of have a foot in both camps on this, because on the one hand, I say the day that the Brad Raffensperger tape became public, that was a predicate for a federal investigation, and I'm not sure why the FBI needed anything more than that. And that was January of 2021. At least in my view, that I don't think you needed any more than that to predicate an investigation. On the other hand, I look at it and I say, and the fake electors stories were breaking all around. And so, if you wanted to open on Trump, you could have done it quite early. On the other hand, I look at it and I say, the sum total of the pre-special counsel investigation and the special counsel investigation has taken 2.5 years to issue a January 6th indictment of Donald Trump, along with 1,200 other January 6th cases. The state attorney general in Michigan has taken the same amount of time to indict a few fake electors. Fani Willis has taken essentially the same amount of time to bring one case. Whoever seems to be investigating this stuff seems to have taken about the same amount of time, and none of them had 1,200 rioters to deal with at the same time. So part of me looks at it and says, yeah, they were focused in the wrong place. Part of me is just in awe of how much they've gotten done in a relatively short period of time, white collar investigations being slow moving objects.
Exactly. And, we had reporting even before the January 6th committee was formed. Remember, before the January 6th committee, there was the Senate Judiciary Committee investigation, and then the House Oversight Committee under Carolyn Maloney also investigating. During those investigations, we knew that the Justice Department was interested in speaking to folks who had already spoken with those committees, and that the Inspector General was involved in, unusually, because there was a subpoena that involved somebody that had a signature on it, somebody from the IG's office. I don't remember if it was that the statement was from included somebody from the IG's office with a signature, so sorry about that. But that the investigation happening at the Justice Department had already started flowing over into looking at criminal behavior above and beyond the rioters before the J6 committee. But I think that in the minds of the public, you'll never be able to convince anybody that the Justice Department was moving in that direction or even had moved, because the committee work was completely public, told in a cinematic way with high production, TV news production values. And it was extremely compelling. Meanwhile, the Justice Department is working literally in secret. And so I don't think we're actually going to get a really good account of that timeline until either Jack Smith puts it in his final report or reporters excavate it in the subsequent years.
So we learned only in the Stanley Cutler History of Watergate, which was published in the 80s, that the Justice Department, prior to the appointment of the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, had learned basically everything except the tapes, and that a huge amount that we associated with the committee had actually been that forensic work had been done by the Justice Department earlier. I'm curious, when we learn the actual history of this investigation, when we will learn it actually got started at the high level as opposed to the ground up level. And I don't feel like we know the answer to that question.
No. And we reported in 2020, when I was writing Stories with Adam, we reported in 2020 that there were debates about whether or not, this is before Merrick Garland got there. This is when we had an acting attorney general and we had an acting deputy attorney general and an acting U.S. attorney.
And the
and that
acting
they were
U.S. attorney was going on television and saying, I've got some seditious conspiracy indictments coming.
Yeah, I mean, he was like, we've got some seditious conspiracy investigations going, and it could include the president. I mean, like, so I think it's hard to say that those conversations weren't happening before Garland got there. We also reported that there were conversations inside of the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., which is sort of the site of all this activity, and essentially has been Jack Smith's team. That they were debating whether or not they had enough to really open an investigation to Roger Stone and his relation to the attack on the Capitol. That there was a debate about whether or not they should have a bottoms-up or a tops-down investigation vis-a-vis the organizers of the January 6 events and Donald Trump himself. I mean, so those conversations were already happening. So if those conversations are happening in the spring of 2020, which is also when they'd already started working on the seditious conspiracy cases against the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, it was in that sort of maybe summer, spring era. My memory's not perfect on this one, but it's hard to imagine that they were already going down those roads and then they just stopped. That's generally not how investigations work. You can get stymied, you can hit dead ends, you can get frustrated, you can fight with your supervisors. Then they did all those things, but I don't think anybody ever just dropped everything and said, well, Merrick Garland's here, so we're not going to do anything anymore.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, it sounds like your view is you're not prepared to say the conventional wisdom is wrong. They were moving full speed ahead from the beginning. You're also not willing to adopt the conventional wisdom. You sort of don't think there's enough evidence to determine it at this point.
Truly, I think to say that office was not moving incredibly fast and doing tons of work would just be full stop wrong. You can fight over whether or not they're working on the right thing. And I also know just from reporting that they were already going down roads that, again, were all questions that needed to be thought about and answered before we could get to this indictment. Do we have enough to look at Roger Stone? Do we have enough to look at this person? How are we going to approach, so all of those things were happening even before Merrick Garland arrived. So it's just, it took this long.
Yeah, the other thing that's always bothered me about the critique is that the indictment of Donald Trump is a totally different document if you believe the ground up investigation and the top down investigation meet at some place. That is, if you think that some agent of Donald Trump met with the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, and by the way, this didn't happen, or at least there's no evidence that it happened, but we didn't know that until we did the investigation, right? So if you think that at some level Donald Trump directed the insurrection, then you have a very different indictment than the one that we do. And you got to know a lot about the insurrection in order to know that. You got to know, that you got to have done the seditious conspiracy charges and learn that they kind of stop at Stewart Rhodes and they kind of stop at Enrique Tarrio. There's no secret meeting where Mark Meadows calls them and says the president wants you to do blank, right? And I think that actually matters, that we know, we don't know that it didn't happen, but we have no evidence that it did happen.
And that prosecutors weren't able to prove it enough to put it in this indictment. And to not be able to prove it enough to put it into this indictment, they had to go through a lot of dead ends. They had to run down a lot of things. Absolutely.
So I want to backtrack and talk about your professional history. When most people think of a Justice Department reporter, to the extent that people think about Justice Department reporters, which
I never did until about 7 years ago.
People I think about people who have been, court reporters, people who've are sort of people who followed federal investigations, former police reporters, former FBI reporters. You came to this, as you said, from business reporting. How did that happen? And how do you go from being Silicon Valley reporter and working. I think you worked for Forbes for a while.
Oh, Fortune, yeah. I loved
Fortune,
working at
sorry.
Fortune. That was like the dream.
And yeah, so what's the Katie Benner history here that takes you from that to a coup at the Justice Department?
Well, I mean, we had to have President Trump to get the coup, so thanks to him. Thanks, Donald. But the all of the things that people usually do before they cover DOJ, interestingly, covering business, the thing that's similar is that there's usually a yes or no, right or wrong answer for a lot of things. Not everything, not like the big political philosophy questions, but like, is there an investigation? Yes or no? Is this person a target? Yes or no? And if you get that wrong, it's a big deal. And I think that's one of the reasons why covering business, it's like, well, did Apple make money or did they lose money? Yes or no? I can suppose anything I want, but I can also be wrong. And unless the reporting is very solid, I will also be proven wrong soon because they will have their quarterly earnings report or their annual report. And so it's that kind of reporting and that kind of lens that I think made it easier for me to make the switch from like business reporting to DOJ than if I'd been like a political reporter where there isn't a lot of right and wrong. I mean, it's like, okay, people did support something or not, or kind of supported it, but then it never really happened anyway. So if you get it, if they change their minds, there's a fuzziness there. There's like no
And the
fuzziness.
poll data moved 2%. Does that mean you were right or you were wrong?
Right, exactly. Whereas like if you say that activist investors are going to take out the CEO of Yahoo and they don't do it, you were wrong. So if you say, that's why I think Justice Department reporters, one of the things I love about the DOJ pool and all of the reporters I worked with from other publications and the press room there is everyone's cognizant of that fact. So like no matter who's pressuring you, whether it's an editor or whether it's, whatever, can't we just say that Mueller is going to indict Donald Trump? It's like, no, we cannot. Like, I don't care. Like, I do not care. Maybe, okay, yes. Can people write that in op-eds and can people say that on, I guess, some news shows? But if you're essentially reporting on the department, no, absolutely you can't say that because you don't know. You really don't know. So that kind of transition, sort of just a reporting transition, was not that hard. Other things were so hard,
Like what?
even it just having no sources. I mean, you haven't lived until you moved to Washington D.C. and try to compete with Devlin Barrett, who has been covering the FBI since he was a toddler, seemingly, and is like the best source reporter. I only thank God that I was working with Adam Goldman and not competing against him, or I would have lost my mind. But that is like, then the process becomes reaching out to people like yourself for coffee, literally every hour of the day, every day, reading the Justice Department manual at the same time, understanding what an indictment is, which I did not know, and reaching out on LinkedIn to every single human being you can find who works at the department to send them a note, only so they can send that note to the head of public affairs so she can call you and yell at you, over rinse and repeat for 9 months. So it was like, I, I drank a lot of coffee. But yeah, so it's like, but the career path was, I started covering something very wonky. I was really general assignment, entry level at a news site, at CNN Money business site. But I started learning about the bond market because, one, no competition there, nobody cares. Two, I am a wonky person, and there's like a rhyme and a reason to bonds and yields that doesn't exist for stocks. So I was more attracted to that. And then three, this was like 2004-ish. And already you could see something happening in the housing market that was so unnatural. And all of that data was all in the bond market and ready and available. And you had this like very interesting interest rate policy under the Fed. So it was like, okay, well, this is actually wonky interesting. And then it became generally interesting because we had a fixed income based financial crisis. So it was like, felt like right place, right time to be part of a really big story as a reporter, which is really fun. I mean, it's like really fun. And then when the Wall Street story became all regulation, I was like, ew, No, but the tech story was so interesting. And Fortune magazine, unfortunately, and all of Time Inc. was like dying. And I thought, I need to get out of here before I'm competing with every colleague I have for a job. So I joined a startup to cover tech, which everyone said I was like insane to do, blah, blah, blah. But Time Inc. was dismantled and sold for parts. So I got out, I think, at a good time. And again, that process of sourcing, like, okay, how do I learn something really fast was the name of the game. And then, as you can imagine, after Donald Trump was elected, you could be writing the most interesting story in the world about almost anything. Alien life could exist, for example, and nobody really cares. And I thought, okay, well, if the big story is happening in Washington, should I consider going to Washington? And it just so happened that DC had lost its DOJ reporter, and Matapuzzo was really tired and he wanted help. And I knew him. So he reached out and he asked if I'd be interested. And that's how it happened. And I thought, okay, well, I've done the thing where I learned something really fast before. I think I can do it again. And he was like, okay, yeah, that's great. You'll just be doing it under tremendous pressure to get scoops, insane amounts of scrutiny, and with colleagues who are extremely stressed out. And I was like, oh, that sounds good.
And was it fun?
It was so fun.
I want to talk about the Justice Department today, but before we do, I want to zero in on something you said, which is that how hard it is to get sources in the department. There's this presumption that a lot of people have that the Justice Department leaks like a sieve because we get all this information about investigations, most of which comes from defense lawyers and witnesses. In my experience, the actual leaks from real prosecutors are pretty rare. What does it mean to have sources at the Justice Department?
So that's interesting. You're right. A lot of information does come from the defense bar, but it's hard for readers to know that because the lead will often say, the Justice Department is asking people questions about X financial transaction in the money laundering case involving this person. So sources familiar say, and obviously the defense lawyers will know what the Justice Department was asking too. But you're right in that the assumption, because of the construction of the lead in the sentence, is that it would be DOJ. And not all defense lawyers are willing to share information. Didn't want to make it sound like that, because if that were the case, it'd be a much easier job. And then it would be, be pretty straightforward. Justice Department sources come in all. I was actually just having lunch with somebody and we were talking about reporting, and one of the most sort of interesting aspects of the job, and it doesn't matter what it is you cover, it's the same. How do you get somebody to do something for you? You're asking somebody to do something for you. And everybody has a different way. Some reporters are very threatening and very terrifying. I wish I could be both of those things, but it doesn't really work.
The Pikachu mask doesn't help. If you're going for terrifying, yeah. There is nothing less terrifying than Pikachu.
I'm not bullying anybody into helping me. But I think that for me, I do try to go to people having demonstrated, and again, this is a very nerdy thing, right? If you're covering the financial crisis and trying to figure out who the short sellers are and who's making money and who's not making money, coming into those conversations with like a really incredible working knowledge of the bond market and fixed income and the inverted yield curve and what was happening in subprime and the ratings agencies helps you because that's the world these people inhabit. And they, at least if nothing else, they like that you respect them enough to try to understand, even if you're still effing up other things and you need help and you're not really sure, at least you tried to understand what's going on. So I did try to come in. I had some of my questions were really basic, like what's an indictment? I don't try to hide when I don't know things, because then how will you ever find out? So I would go in with very basic questions. But I think that,
by the way, the what's an indictment question, people think that's a stupider question than it is.
Well, clearly right? The country doesn't know what it is, because they thought Jack Smith was going to indict Donald Trump. And they thought, right. I remember getting calls from, people, producers and people on the Hill saying, do you think Jack Smith will indict Donald Trump over the weekend?
And you're like, no, I think maybe he will seek an indictment from a grand jury
Right.
on a day that the grand jury meets.
And if he does it over the weekend, we'll definitely know, because we'll see a bunch of grand jurors marching down to the courthouse on a Sunday afternoon. And you wonder why that is. So, I mean, but that's one of those issues. That's one of those areas where you can actually get pretty far not knowing, because you just know somebody got in trouble and they're going to be accused of a crime. But once you're actually covering the department, I think it makes sense to just know that people are going to think you're an idiot, but ask the question, get the information, but also understand that conversation, that point of connection, is a real opportunity to understand lots of things beyond the answer. That person's communication style, how they approach giving you information, how much they were willing to give. Did they give more than what you asked for? Did they mind the call? If you have to call somebody again and again, trying to get far more invasive items out of them than what's an indictment, that's good stuff to know. You're learning a lot. You are learning a lot. So what is a Justice Department source? A Justice Department source, there are many flavors, and I'll go from like most primary would be the public affairs people at the Justice Department. They are sources. That is literally their job. And they are given permission by the principals of the department, whether it's Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, head of the criminal division, whomever, to share information with the press. Sometimes they do it on the record, sometimes they do it in press releases, and sometimes they do it in off-the-record briefings with attributable to a senior DOJ official. And sometimes they do it in briefings where nothing's attributable, but they're like, just for your information, you should be near your computer today. You don't know what the story is, but it's very helpful information. So that's your first line of defense. Principles.
And by the way, that type of you might not want to make plans this evening from the right person at the right time. Not grand jury information, not anything improper. It can actually be misleading in the sense that if, say, it causes you, the entire press corps, to expect one thing and then something else happens, it can be a little bit surprising.
Yeah.
But it's a very common type of thing that is consistent with the obligations of the officer in question, but also can be very helpful.
And then there are people who are willing to explain procedures to you, rules of the game. Those can be people inside the department, people who used to work at the department. They can be an OPA. I mean, a great example is, we had, I won't say who, but I mean, it was in the stories at the time that were published. So it's okay to say some of this, but when Trump's Ukraine call happened, the Justice Department did a briefing and everyone described it according to senior Justice Department officials. It wasn't like me to pretend the department didn't give this to us, but the department gave us a briefing with senior Justice Department officials to walk us through why that call had been looked at by the Justice Department and did not eventuate in a criminal investigation. Now, people can agree or disagree. They can say they spun you, they lied to you, they whatever, but that's also a source of information.
Right. It's a super helpful source in the sense that the department is explaining its thinking, whether that's right or wrong. It's really highly valuable.
It's highly valuable and it's historic too. I mean, think about all of the press briefings that happened around WMDs. Of course, we found out later they didn't exist, but the existence of the press briefings, the news, it's part of the record of what an administration's doing and whether or not, and how much we can trust them in a bigger way. So that's the kind of source. There are disgruntled people in every organization, covering the tech industry. I'm sure you noticed that when layoffs were happening, the perks were going away, the salaries weren't as high. Suddenly there were a lot more negative stories about different tech companies, including Facebook, because people are just more disgruntled. So you're not going to have those people talking to the press when they're happy and they're making $250,000 a year, getting free lunch every day, getting their dry cleaning done, and getting a bus to work. Like, they generally don't talk. During the Trump administration, there were many, many, many unhappy people. And so I'll just say that in my work, some of the stories that I broke earlier on were about a change in policy internally, initiatives changing, shutting down offices without telling anybody, shutting down. The initiative was an office that helped indigent people get legal aid. So just little things like that. Again, nobody's breaking a grand jury rule. Nobody's giving out information about a prosecution. And then what you're always trying to look for, though, are people who, for me, it's because they understood I was interested and was willing to do a lot of homework to understand something, who are willing to help you understand more technical things that might eventuate in scoops, moves, anticipating moves the department could make. So I think an example of that would be around the China Initiative program. You didn't have to be a rocket scientist to know that when Biden got to the department, that administration was going to take a different look at the idea of something called the China Initiative, at a time when there was a lot of hate crimes against Asian people during the pandemic, and because some of those prosecutions had been failures. They hadn't worked out. The department had lost and, had ruined a couple lives. So,
and also because the nomenclature is itself upsetting, right? It implies that it implies a degree of loyalty suspicion around an ethnicity,
right.
rather than a concern about an adversary actor
Right.
that may recruit among Americans.
And I think realistically, we saw, like, I had written a story about how Saudi Arabia had put spies inside of Twitter to get information about dissidents. It's not like China is the only country doing this. So ultimately, the China Initiative was rebranded with not a country-specific name, et cetera, et cetera. But you did not have to be a rocket scientist to know that this was probably going to happen. So in terms of sourcing, it just meant going to every single human being I'd ever known, inside the department, outside the department, who'd ever touched the China Initiative, worked on a case, and just be like, "What are you? Sorry to call again. what are you hearing?" And and again, that's not it's not grand jury information. It's not about a prosecution. It's not about it's not about something secret per se. It's just something the administration would probably not want you to break. They just want to get it done before and roll it out. So those are the main kinds of DOJ sources.
Yeah, so that's super helpful. I think of like DOJ sources as kind of falling into like categories that, like, there is the relatively rare investigative leaker either at the FBI or the Justice Department, but it's like
I really want to meet that person. Yeah.
It's way rarer than most news consumers seem to believe. When I was covering the department every day, most of my sources were policy sources. And, there are some I don't think he would mind my saying this. There are some Lawfare writers who I met because I would call the public affairs office as an editorial writer. They wouldn't be able to answer my question. So they, would call David Chris down from the deputy's office and say,
Totally.
get on, I'm going to put you on the phone with David Chris. And we had a long conversation about FISA, and that's how I met David, who, now writes for Lawfare. And that conversation was, a deputy's office person in the public affairs office, recruited by the public affairs office because they couldn't answer my questions and they wanted me to get on the phone with someone who could answer them authoritatively.
Totally.
So I want to talk about the department now. Almost everything we've talked about has been the department in the Trump administration. Merrick Garland and Lisa Monaco come in with this idea that they're going to reestablish the regular order, reestablish the norms of the department, and do everything according to the usual way, the traditions that had been done violence to. Now you have Republicans shouting about weaponization of the Justice Department. Um, uh, to what extent do you think there has been a traditional order reestablished, and to what extent is should we look at Merrick Garland and Lisa Monaco as just sort of democratic Bill Barrs and Jeff Sessions is?
Yeah. So, this is good. I love this question. I mean, it's so dirty. But I think, keep in mind, I went on a book leave earlier in this year, and now I'm coming back. I'm writing features at the time, so I'm not the Justice Department beat reporter anymore. So some of my information and observations are 8 months old or whatever. But I will say that when Garland and Lisa came in and said, we are going to reestablish the norms of the department and go back to regular order, and with an eye toward making the American people trust this department again, I thought that is a losing proposition, and you are setting yourselves up to fail. You can't do that in an environment that's polarized. And I think this is a thing that people don't want to say out loud, but history, when we live it, it changes us, and we're not the same people we were before the thing happened. And departments, institutions are made up of people, and so the Trump era has changed the department and forced people to ask questions they didn't have to ask before. So can you go back to normal order? Or do you address the question of when, as a career person, do you quit because something is happening that's so outrageous that you can't, it violates what you think of as your oath to the Constitution? Well, the minute you start asking that question and talking to your staff about it, that's not normal order. It's just not. You are nodding toward a new reality. So, and Garland didn't want to, I think we did a story about this. He didn't want to go into the department and interview every person who worked there about what had happened in the previous 4 years and figure out what had gone on and try to address it. He was like, that's for the IG to do. If something screwed up happened, whatever. I believe we can just start fresh and go back to regular order. And I think that is actually impossible. The Justice Department, and especially the FBI, has a really interesting history. The history of the FBI, you had J. Edgar Hoover doing dirty work for multiple presidents. And that's no longer part of the FBI culture. But in making that huge change, and we can be really critical of Jim Comey or whatever, like I'm happy to do that too, but he was also a proponent of some other sorts of cultural changes. But in making that sort of big change, Mueller did it, of course, after 9/11. Regular order changes too. Regular order under Hoover was to be a henchman for the president and do a lot of dirty work and a lot of effed up things. Regular order was to investigate civil rights figures. Regular order was to violate constitutional rights of American citizens. You could argue, because it happened often enough, that was a part of regular order of the FBI. Under Mueller, after 9/11, regular order meant paying attention to a different kind of domestic threat. So in a post-Trump era, to say we're just going to go back to regular order, I thought that is either extremely naive or just something that's very comforting to say that you want people to believe, but you understand there's a bigger job to do. I would like to believe it's the latter, but I haven't really seen evidence of that.
So you make a really interesting point, but it's pregnant with the question of what the new regular order should be. If the old regular order is that we abandoned is that the Justice Department is apolitical, that it serves the president.
And you just follow the rules and everything's okay.
In a policy sense, you just follow the rules and you follow the justice manual and you don't target people for political reasons and you don't blah, blah, blah. And now we can't go back to that because, we're all changed by the experience of the last 5 or 6 years. So there's some new order that we're going to establish. What does it look like?
And that's a great question. So I just go back in history to the travel ban, which we've all forgotten because of freaking gajillion things have happened since the travel ban. Okay. The Justice Department went back and they rewrote it multiple times until it finally passed muster with the Supreme Court. Some would argue that what was different about that is that it all happened in public because DOJ has been asked by the White House before to do things that were like, hey, that's not really legal. And then they went back and behind the scenes went back and forth with the Office of Legal Counsel and, and the White House lawyers and hammered it out to make it legal, to make it pass muster. And then they unroll it. So it's like, okay, well, if you don't do it that way, which is tradition, but does have an implicit, the White House wants to push the bounds of the law in it, you don't do it that way. Instead, you just come out with something fully that will not pass muster, legally roll it out, take the Justice Department by surprise. Is it regular order to, okay, I'm going to take this and do what I would normally do if you had not put this out on Twitter like a crazy person, but I just sent it over to my office and try to make it work? Or is it, I throw up my hands and I quit because you didn't follow regular order. You didn't follow that piece of you know what I mean? It's sort of like there was debate inside of the department about what to do. We know what Sally Yates did. She was the acting attorney general. She quit. She was like, I'm out. Or she was fired. Wait. But you know what I mean? Like she was like, I can't support this. This is terrible. But there were other people inside the civil division, a division that's very, very, very dedicated to apoliticalness, process, regular order. They defend the United States in court. That's what they do. They're not supposed to care about what the thing is. Is it legal? There was actually more debate than, what we would have thought. Because it's like, well, okay, well, what if instead of tweeting this out, we had just gotten this like we normally would have, run our pens through it, circled all the things that are illegal, put in all of our suggestions to make it pass muster, sent it back, and then the White House had done the thing. We'd done that 4 times, and then we did it. And again, so I don't know what it looks like. I think that part of a new normal at the Justice Department is actually having to interrogate where the norms are weak and be a little bit more honest about it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. It seems to me the another part of it is don't lose in court, right? So if people can wave their hands about weaponization all they want, but if Jack Smith wins these cases and gets them sustained on appeal, that actually answers the question. Ditto a lot of these January 6th cases, right? Ditto, but conversely, not ditto with respect to the the student debt relief initiative, right? If you go into court and you make a lot of your base happy, but then you get your ass kicked in court, and by the way, in a fashion that's quite predictable.
Yes, that was not a surprise.
It was not a surprise to anybody, including the White House and the Justice Department. That people are going to look at it and should look at it maybe a little bit more askance. And I wonder if in a way that is not true when we all paid homage to norms, that actually winning cases is a big part of self-justifying. If you go into a grand jury and you cannot get an indictment of Andy McCabe, you've got a problem. On the other, and if you go into court, John Durham, and you've indicted 2 people for your conspiracy theory and they both get acquitted in, a few hours of jury time, you've got a problem. On the other hand, if you're similarly, I suppose if you're prosecuting, you have a plea deal with Hunter Biden and a judge takes it apart with a few questions, you've got a problem. But if you can issue your press release on the day of your action and then get it through court successfully, there's a measure of self-justification in that process.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how do you do that without being overly careful, without saying like, well, I don't want to bring a case that I could lose, which, if you're you're going to lose sometimes. So I don't have an answer to your very good question, but now I'm going to think about it a lot.
I think it's a really interesting in a world in which the post-Watergate norms have died. What are we replacing them with? And are we replacing them with anything like an agreement, or are we replacing them with an asymmetrical agreement in which, you know, Merrick Garland will pay homage to the old norms, uh, Bill Barr will pay homage to the old norms, but a lot of people won't believe that either of them are behaving according to them. And I have my own opinion about both of them.
Yeah. And of course, at the end of the day, we're so politicized that I think that one of the things we learned over the last few years, unfortunately, is that our institutions, their legitimacy comes from belief that they are trustworthy. So we don't trust the Supreme Court anymore. We don't trust the Justice Department. We don't really trust, there are all these things that we don't trust. And so you wonder what the bigger issue is, So again, Merrick Garland's like, I'm going to come in and reestablish norms. I'm going to go back to regular order. And I'm like, there is that goal in and of itself is like, it's not realistic.
All right, I'm going to wrap up, but before we do, you've been on leave and you've written a book. What's your book about?
Writing. Well, the book is about education in America and race, not about the Justice Department at all. I'd written a story while I was covering the Justice Department. It was a blur those years. My goodness, was Jeff Sessions was the Attorney General, or Matt Whitaker maybe? Woo! But there was a school in Louisiana that was getting a lot of Black students into Ivy League schools. And I got a tip, actually, weirdly, through a Justice Department source. I mean, hey, you take anything you can get. This person was like, this isn't really about the Justice Department, but there are a lot of problems at the school. And so the school in and of itself was extremely abusive. And they were they had convinced these students that the only way for them to get out of the South and to get to good schools was to kind of submit themselves to, behavior that was fraudulent, but also like a lot of abuse. And I thought it was a really interesting way to look at, big questions like, well, why is opportunity in America so confined to one's ability to get to a set of colleges? When I was growing up, I'm old. So when I was growing up, you could still do well in America and not going to college. My dad didn't go to college. You could still be a blue collar worker. You could still be a person who worked their way up in a company, starting in a non-executive, in a lower paid position. You could start out as an administrative assistant and you could work your way up. But now you have to go to college. So how does that constrain opportunity in America? And then also like the issue of race, like one of the things that the students did, the admissions officers responded really strongly to, was to play up negative stereotypes of Black America and say that they had lived these experiences when sometimes they had not. And so what does that say about what white people want of minorities? What does it say about, the sort of twinning of negative experience with the minority experience? When the affirmative action decision came down to the Supreme Court and Joe Biden was like, it's okay, if you're a minority student, you can still write an essay about how terrible your life has been. And everybody will know you're not white. I wanted to like scream. I was like, that's the problem. Like, don't say that. That's fucked up. Anyway, so
right. It's the conservative majority of the Supreme Court and a bunch of educational bureaucrats teaming up to create an incentive structure in which if you're applying to college and you're non-white, you have to have a horror story.
And why do we want all of our minorities to be broken fundamentally? How does that serve us as a country? What narratives does it serve? What power structures does it serve? Like, who benefits from that? I'm going to tell you, as somebody who's not white, it doesn't necessarily benefit the minority. So, I thought it was anyway, and I'm working on it with my colleague, Erica, who's wonderful. And it's just, we're not going to be done this year. We have a lot of work to do, but we did, we're biting off like kind of a series of sensitive topics. So we are So I did take some months off to work on that, and we'll be continuing to work on it. But it was a really interesting thing to do. It was like all of the Justice Department stuff that had been in my head. It was a really, efficient way to clear it out quite quickly. To just look at things that I think I'm very passionate about, and I think that the way that we think of ourselves as Americans, who has opportunity, especially economic opportunity, like we've focused a lot on race over the last several years, and we should always think, about real, like real policy things around race. I think that's always fine, but the economic question is sort of interesting. This is what Biden's been focusing on, even though it's gotten lost in the shuffle. The question of who has economic opportunity in America, it's not that it solves all ills. I'm just going to say that if more people have opportunity, I think we can start to ease a lot of other issues that we have with one another that are really hard to do when you have huge swaths of the country cut off from the ability to get a job that pays you enough money to have a life where you can afford to live in a home, rent or buy, where you could have a child and conceivably have enough money to feed that child, and where there's opportunity that doesn't cost you, what is a 4-year college now? $62,000 a year. And I think those are huge, important, pressing questions for the country. I think they're huge, important questions for people who don't come from a lot of opportunity, like myself. I grew up in a rural part of the country that has been decimated by a lot of 90s era policies, and where we have to start thinking deeply about not only whether or not people have opportunity, but what are the narratives we tell about people who don't have it? Like, how do we think about indigent people? How do we think about people without money? Is there a disdain there? Is there, like, of course, I think there is personally, and there's a way of making them less citizens, lesser citizens. And if you do that enough, I think that it actually feeds back into the political questions we've had through this whole conversation. Who do you want to be the president? Who do you believe? How do you participate in democracy? Do you believe that the system is legitimate? And if you don't, who do you elect? And who do you support? So I think there's like I don't know. I think that thinking about those things is just like so awesome. And obviously I'm a huge dork, like listen to me. I'm talking to you from the public library in Maine, Maine. Because I just took out a bunch of reference books.
We are going to leave it there. Katie Benner, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at @ThatWasChatter.